They cut down my trees while I was at work, and by the time I got home, there was nothing left but 6 raw stumps bleeding sap into the dirt, like something had been killed and nobody even bothered to cover it up. And I remember standing there thinking, okay, if that's how this is going to go, then I'm going to make sure nobody ever builds a damn thing on that land again. I didn't always think like that. I wasn't the kind of guy who went looking for fights, not with neighbors anyway. I bought that place back in 2020, just outside a small town in northern Georgia. One of those areas where farmland slowly turns into subdivisions, but not all at once. You still had patches of open land, old fences leaning sideways, barns that looked like they'd outlive all of us, and my place sat right in the middle of that transition. 2 acres, nothing fancy, just a modest house, a wraparound porch I barely used, and a backyard that felt bigger than it actually was because of the trees. There were 6 of them, white oaks, tall, thick, older than anything else around. You could tell just by looking at them they'd been there long before the roads were paved, probably long before the property lines even existed. In the summer they cast this wide, cool shade that covered my entire backyard, and in the evenings the light would come through the leaves in this soft, broken way that made everything feel slower, I guess, calmer, like time didn't rush as much back there. I didn't realize how attached I was to those trees until they were gone, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The lot next door had been empty for as long as I'd lived there, just grass, a slight slope, and those 6 oaks lining what would eventually become the boundary between my place and whoever came next. I always figured someone would buy it eventually, build something big and modern that didn't quite fit, but I hoped, maybe naively, that whoever it was would appreciate what was already there. Then one afternoon I came home and saw a black SUV parked out there, not dusty like the trucks you usually see around here, but clean, polished, city clean, and standing beside it was a guy in his mid-40s, maybe, wearing sunglasses like he was posing for something, talking on his phone while pacing the lot like he already owned it, which, I found out later, he did. His name was Daniel Mercer. I met him the next day. I was out by the mailbox when he walked over, introduced himself with a firm handshake, the kind that lingers just a second too long. Just closed on the lot, he said, smiling like everything was already exactly how he wanted it. Figured I'd come meet my neighbor. Now, Daniel wasn't rude, not at first, but there was something about the way he looked around, like he was already measuring things in his head, already deciding what needed to change, and sure enough, about 5 minutes into the conversation, he nodded toward the trees. "Those yours?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, "they're on my side." He tilted his head, squinting a little. "Ever thought about trimming them back? They're pretty close to the line." I shrugged. "They've been there longer than either of us. I kinda like them the way they are." He smiled again, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Fair enough, just thinking ahead. I've got some plans for this place." A couple days later, I met his architect, guy named Eric Sloan, thin, always dressed in black like he was allergic to color, drove a silver Tesla that looked wildly out of place on that gravel edge. He didn't say much, but when he looked at those trees, it wasn't appreciation. It was calculation, like they were a problem he hadn't solved yet. Over the next few weeks, I'd see them out there more often, walking the property, marking things, talking in low voices. Once or twice Daniel waved, kept things polite, but every time the conversation drifted back to those trees, it felt like we were having 2 different discussions. I saw shade, history, privacy. He saw obstruction. About a month in, he brought it up again, a little more directly this time. "I had a survey done," he said one afternoon, holding a rolled-up set of papers like it proved something. "Those trees are right on the boundary, might even cross over in places." I nodded slowly. "I had one done too when I bought the place. They're on my side." He gave this small, almost amused exhale. "Surveys can be off, depends who did them." "Maybe," I said, but mine was pretty clear. There was a pause, one of those quiet moments where nobody's raising their voice, but you can feel something tightening underneath. Then he clapped me lightly on the shoulder like we were still just neighbors chatting. "Well," he said, "we'll figure it out." That should have been my warning, not what he said, but how he said it, like the outcome was already decided, and I just hadn't caught up yet. A few weeks went by, nothing happened, no construction, no equipment, just occasional visits, and I started to think maybe he'd adjusted his plans. Maybe the trees would stay after all. Maybe I'd misread the whole thing. Then came that Wednesday. It was a long day at work, Nothing unusual, just one of those slow drags where you're thinking more about getting home than anything else. And I remember pulling into my driveway, already picturing the backyard, that shade, that quiet, and then I saw the truck. Big white tree service truck, parked halfway into Daniel's lot, with chips scattered across the ground like confetti after something you didn't want to celebrate. And for a second, my brain didn't connect the dots, not right away, because it didn't make sense. Then I looked up, and everything just dropped. The sky looked wrong, too open, too bright. And it took me a second to understand why. Because the trees, those 6 massive oaks that had been there for decades, were gone. Not trimmed, not cut back. Gone. All that was left were 6 wide stumps lined up along the edge of my property, raw and pale against the dirt, like fresh scars, and I just stood there, keys still in my hand, trying to process how something that big, that permanent, could just disappear in a single afternoon. I could hear a chainsaw in the distance, winding down. One of the workers was loading equipment back into the truck, like the job was already done. And I remember thinking, real slow, real clear. Somebody just made a very expensive mistake. Or maybe it wasn't a mistake at all. I walked toward the truck without really feeling my legs move, like my body had already decided what needed to happen and my brain was still catching up. The smell hit me first. That fresh cut wood smell, sharp and green, and almost sweet, the kind you'd normally associate with a campfire or a clean job well done. Except this wasn't that. This felt wrong, like walking into your house and realizing someone's been in it while you were gone. One of the guys, mid-50s, sunburned neck, sawdust all over his shirt, looked up when he saw me coming. "You the homeowner?" he asked, casual, like we were about to talk about payment or something routine. "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I am. Who hired you?" He didn't hesitate, just reached into the truck and pulled out a clipboard, flipped a page, and turned it toward me. "Job was ordered this morning. Full removal, 6 oaks, signed off right here." I didn't even need to read the name to know what I was about to see, but I looked anyway. Daniel Mercer. Signed clean, confident, no hesitation in that signature. I nodded once, handed the clipboard back, and just stood there for a second, staring past him at the stumps, trying to decide if I was angrier than I was stunned, or the other way around. "Everything okay?" the guy asked, a little more cautious now. "No," I said quietly. "No, it's not." I turned and walked straight toward Daniel's place. He hadn't started building yet, but he had a temporary setup, a trailer, some equipment, a makeshift patio area where he'd sit in the evenings like he already lived there. And sure enough, he was out back, glass of red wine in his hand, talking on his phone like nothing in the world had just happened. He saw me coming and ended the call mid-sentence. "Hey," he said, relaxed, almost cheerful. "What's up?" I stopped a few feet away, close enough to see my reflection in the glass he was holding. "You cut down my trees." He took a sip before answering. Actually took a sip, like we were discussing the weather. "Yeah," he said. "We had them removed this afternoon." I repeated, my voice tightening. "Those trees were on my property." He tilted his head slightly, like he was considering that information for the first time. "Were they?" he said. "Because from what I've seen, they were right on the line, and some of those roots were definitely crossing over." "That doesn't matter," I said. "The trunks were on my land." He gave a small shrug. "Look, they were dropping leaves everywhere, and I've got foundation work coming up. Didn't want any issues later." I stared at him for a second, trying to figure out if he actually believed what he was saying, or if he just didn't care. "You didn't ask," I said. "You didn't confirm, you just cut them down." Another sip of wine, slow, deliberate. "I figured it was easier to handle it now," he said. "Save us both the headache." "Us?" I let out a short, humorless laugh. "You think this helped me?" He sighed then, like I was the one being difficult. "Look, if it turns out there was some overlap, we can work something out. Plant new ones, maybe clean it up." "New ones," I said. "Those trees were older than both of us." He gave me that same smile again, the one that never quite reached his eyes. "Well, they're gone now. Not much point dwelling on it, right?" And that was it. That was the moment something in me shifted, not explosive, not loud, just cold. I nodded slowly. "You're right," I said. "No point dwelling on it." Then I turned around and walked back to my house. I didn't yell, didn't threaten, didn't do anything dramatic. And I think that threw him off more than anything would have. Because people like Daniel, they expect a reaction they can manage, anger they can deflect, but calm, quiet. That makes them uneasy. The first thing I did was go inside and pull out the file cabinet in my office, the one with all the documents from when I bought the property. And right there, in a folder labeled Survey 2020, was exactly what I needed. I spread it out on the table, hands steady now, no shaking, no hesitation, just focus. Every boundary line, every measurement, clearly marked, and those 6 trees, every single one of them, sat firmly on my side, not on the line, not overlapping. Some of them were nearly 8 feet inside my property. 8 feet. I took pictures of the survey, then went back outside and photographed every stump, every angle, made sure the fence line and markers were visible. I even grabbed a measuring tape, documented the distances, because if this was going where I thought it was going, I wasn't leaving anything up to interpretation. The crew was still packing up when I walked back over. The same guy from before looked at me, a little more guarded now. "I need a copy of that work order," I said. He hesitated. "We don't usually." "I'm not asking for usually." I cut in, still calm, still level. "I'm asking for a copy." Something in my tone must have landed, because he nodded and made a photocopy right there in the truck. Handed it to me without another word. "Did he say whose trees they were?" I asked. The guy scratched the back of his neck. "He said they were his, or that they were causing issues for his build. We didn't question it." "Yeah," I said softly. "I figured." I went back inside, sat down, and stared at everything laid out in front of me. The survey, the photos, the signed work order. And for a moment, just a brief one, I considered letting it go, taking whatever apology he might eventually offer, planting new trees, moving on. But then I looked out the window at the empty stretch where those oaks used to stand, the sunlight hitting places it had never touched before, and it felt like something had been taken from me without permission, not just property, but time, history, something you don't get back by planting a sapling. So I picked up my phone and called a lawyer. His name was Richard Hale, older guy, been practicing real estate law longer than I'd probably been alive, calm voice, the kind that doesn't rush, doesn't react until he has all the facts. I explained everything, start to finish, and when I emailed him the survey and the photos, there was a long pause on the line while he reviewed them. Then he exhaled, slow, deliberate. "Well," he said, "that's about as clear as it gets." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means your neighbor didn't just make a mistake," Richard said. "He committed timber trespass, and in this state, that's not a small thing." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. "Define not small." He gave a quiet chuckle. "Triple damages, minimum, if we can prove intent, and from what you've told me, I'd say we can." I let that sit for a second. "Triple? What kind of numbers are we talking about?" "That depends on the value of the trees," he said. "Age, species, size. We'll need an arborist to assess them, but mature oaks like that?" He paused. "You're not looking at replacement cost. You're looking at real value." For the first time since I got home, I felt something other than anger. I felt possibility. Not revenge, not exactly, something quieter, more precise. "All right," I said. "What's the next step?" Richard didn't hesitate. "We send a demand letter, give him a chance to make it right before we take it further." I glanced out the window again at Daniel's lot, where he was now talking to his architect, both of them standing exactly where those trees used to be, gesturing, planning, already moving forward like nothing had happened. "Yeah," I said, "let's give him that chance." But deep down, I already knew how that was going to go. The demand letter went out that same week. Clean, professional, no emotion in it, just facts, property survey attached, photographic evidence, the signed work order, and a formal notice of timber trespass with intent, and at the bottom, a number left intentionally blank, pinning the arborist's valuation, which, according to Richard, was where things would start to feel very real for Daniel. We didn't hear back for a few days. Then about a week later, a response came in, not from Daniel himself, of course, but from his attorney, and I remember sitting in Richard's office while he read it, leaning back in his chair, glasses low on his nose, that faint smile creeping in like he'd seen this exact script play out 100 times before. "Well," he said, tapping the page, "they're going with honest mistake." I exhaled through my nose. "Of course they are." Richard nodded. "They're claiming the boundary was unclear, that your trees posed a potential risk to future construction, and," he paused, just long enough to make it land, "they're offering to replace the trees." I let out a short laugh. Replace how? He flipped the page toward me. 6 saplings. Planted at their expense. I just stared at it for a second. 6 saplings. Like you could erase 80 years of growth with something you pick up from a nursery on a Saturday morning. Richard chuckled softly. Yeah, I figured you'd like that part. What happens if we don't accept? I asked, even though I already knew. He folded the letter neatly, set it aside. Then we file. I nodded once. Then let's file. And just like that, it moved from a neighborhood dispute to something a whole lot bigger. The arborist came out a few days later. Older woman, knew more about trees than anyone I'd ever met. She walked the line slowly, measuring the stumps, examining the grain, taking notes like she was documenting something that mattered, and when she was done, she gave me a number that made me sit down. About 26,000 per tree, she said. Conservative estimate. I did the math in my head. 6 trees. That was $156,000. And under state law, if intent was proven, triple. When Richard filed the suit 3 weeks later, that number was front and center, along with everything else. And for the first time since all this started, I saw something shift in Daniel. He wasn't smiling anymore. Construction never began. The plan stayed on paper, and instead of architects and contractors, there were meetings, paperwork, quiet conversations in driveways that stopped when I walked outside. The energy changed, not loud, not dramatic, just tense, like something was building underneath everything. The case took months to get to court, longer than I expected, but Richard said that was normal. These things don't move fast, and sometimes that works in your favor. By the time we got there, it wasn't just about the trees anymore. It was about intent, about whether Daniel had knowingly crossed a line, literally and legally, and whether he thought he could get away with it. Sitting in that courtroom felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life play out. But when it was my turn to testify, everything came back sharp. The smell of the wood, the look on his face, the way he said, "They're gone now." Like that was the end of the conversation. His attorney tried to frame it differently, said it was a misunderstanding, a miscommunication, that Daniel acted in good faith based on his own survey, that the trees were a hazard, a liability, something that needed to be addressed. Then our arborist took the stand. She didn't rush, didn't raise her voice, just explained, piece by piece, that those trees were healthy, stable, not a risk to any structure, that their removal wasn't necessary, and that their value wasn't something you could replace with saplings. At one point, Daniel's attorney asked her, "Isn't it true that trees this size can pose a danger if left unmanaged?" She looked at him for a moment, then said, "Anything can pose a danger if you're looking for a reason to remove it." You could feel the room shift after that. The jury deliberated for 4 hours, 4 long, quiet hours where you sit there pretending you're not replaying every second of the last few months in your head. And when they came back in, I could tell from their faces before the verdict was even read. They found in my favor. They didn't go for the full triple damages. Richard said juries sometimes hesitate when the numbers get that high, but they awarded $52,000, plus legal fees, plus court costs. It wasn't the $500,000 it could have been, but it was enough. Enough to make a point. Daniel didn't react, not outwardly, just sat there, jaw tight, staring straight ahead like he was trying to process how something that seemed so small at the beginning had turned into this. After the trial, things moved quickly. He couldn't pay, not all of it, not with everything else tied up in that property. So he put the lot up for sale, quiet listing at first, then more public when it became clear he needed out. I didn't rush anything, didn't push, just let the process unfold. When the sale finally went through, it covered part of the judgment, not all, and that's where the lien came in. Richard handled the paperwork, placed it cleanly, legally, and just like that, the land Daniel had planned to build his dream home on wasn't his problem anymore, but it also wasn't anyone else's solution. The developer who bought it had plans, big ones, but when they ran the title and saw the lien, everything stalled, permits got delayed, financing got complicated, and eventually, they walked away. For 2 years, that lot sat empty. No house, no foundation, just grass growing where something was supposed to be, and 6 wide, weathered stumps slowly blending back into the ground like the land was taking them back. I'd sit on my porch sometimes in the evenings, looking out at that space, the light hitting it differently now. No shade, no canopy, just open sky where something used to stand, And I'd think about how quickly things can change when someone decides the rules don't apply to them. People have asked me if it was worth it, all the time, the stress, the cost of going through something like that, and I never give them a simple answer. Because it wasn't just about the money, and it wasn't even just about the trees. It was about the moment he looked at me and said, "They're gone now." Like that settled it, like the damage being done meant the conversation was over. But it doesn't work like that. At least it didn't this time. Now here's the part one still think about. If he had just asked, really asked, if he'd come over, sat down, said, "Hey, this is what I'm worried about. Can we figure something out?" I probably would have worked with him, trimmed the branches, maybe even removed one or two if there was a real issue. But he didn't. He made a decision for both of us and assumed I'd just have to live with it. And in the end, he's the one who didn't. So I'm curious, if you were sitting on that jury, hearing everything, seeing the evidence, watching how it all unfolded, would you have made the same call? Or do you think 52,000 and everything that came after was too much for 6 trees? Let me know what you think, because honestly, people don't agree on this one nearly as much as you'd expect.